She moved through the wreckage with careful steps, her three-fingered feet leaving soft imprints in the red dust. The sky was painted with bruised clouds, and the wrecked hull of the human vessel lay half buried in the dunes. Metal panels jutted out at odd angles, twisted like broken limbs. Distant winds sighed through open vents, bringing a faint scent of burning circuits. She paused at a jagged edge, her lavender skin stretched tight over slender bones, and listened for any sign of life. In the hush, she heard a low groan. The alien girl knelt beside a battered stabilizer beam and peered into the darkness beneath the ruined deck plate. Faint breaths whispered through a crack in his suit. She reached out with gentle caution, her fingertips brushing against the cool metal of his leg guard. The human's visor was cracked, and a thin trickle of blood rose from a cut on his temple. She did not know his language, but she sensed his pain dot with a soft hiss. She peeled back a torn flap of the suit to reveal a strange swelling beneath. The orb-shaped bulge sat just above his knee plating, where synthetic fibers and organic flesh met. It pulsed in time with his ragged heartbeat. The alien girl's golden eyes widened as she observed tiny veins of bioluminescent blue creeping along its surface. The glow was faint, but in the dim light it shimmered like a trapped firefly. She traced a careful line around the base of the swelling, noting its smooth, rubbery texture. It did not feel hot to the touch, but it vibrated softly beneath her fingers. The survivor hissed through clenched teeth, and his hands curled in discomfort. She held still, hoping he would calm. She laid a hand on his shoulder, offering the weak comfort of her presence. He looked into her eyes, confusion and relief mingling in his gaze. In a quiet tone she did not understand, she made soothing cooing sounds. Her species had no word for pain, but they recognized it in others. She dug into a small pouch at her belt and produced a folded cloth woven from desert vines. With utmost care, she wrapped it around the swelling, pressing lightly, to see if gentle pressure would ease the pain. The cloth absorbed a trickle of dark fluid that seeped from the suit's lining. The human managed to speak a word that sounded like help. She did not answer, but she nodded. She studied the swelling further, hoping to learn its secret. The bioluminescent veins seemed alive, shrinking away from the cloth bandage as if afraid of its fibers. She lifted the bandage to observe the swelling's reaction. The light inside the orb dimmed for a moment, then flared brighter, believing a gentle massage might soothe it. She placed her palm over the swelling and began to rub in small circles. Her touch was firm but kind, guided by centuries of healing traditions. At first, the survivor sighed in relief as the swelling softened beneath her hand. Then it shivered and the gentle glow deepened. The warmth returned, growing stronger. The orb swelled larger against her palm, trembling like a living thing. Her heart raced when she felt the orb pulse violently. It grew warmer by the second, and the texture shifted under her fingers. Suddenly, tiny spores burst free from the surface, drifting into the air like silver dust. Each spore glowed faintly before disappearing into the shadows. The survivor gasped and jerked his leg away, pain flashing in his eyes. She recoiled, startled by the sudden change. For a long moment they sat in tense stillness. The dim glow of the spilling spores painted ghostly patterns on the broken walls. She stared at her palm, now stained with bioluminescent residue. The survivor tried to stand, but his weight slipped and he fell back onto the cracked hull. She reached out to steady him, concern etched on her face. She whispered soothing sounds as she retrieved her gear pouch again. Tonight, the desert would offer no foolish rest for either of them. Something alive and unknown clung to his flesh, stronger than metal. She would not let him suffer. With determination, she lifted him into her arms, the swelling still throbbing. Between his legs, its glow pulsing like a heartbeat of its own. Together, they would seek the old research outpost at the edge of the dunes, and she would find a way to tame this strange, living wound. The desert night was cold and quiet. The violet sky held a thin moon like a faint smile. Dunes rolled in gray shadows. Hills rose like silent waves around them. Metal wreckage lay half buried in shifting sand. The alien girl carried the human carefully. She felt the weight of his body and the strange bulge pressing against her thigh. Each step was slow, each foot sank into soft sand. Small winds lifted. Dust around them, she scanned the horizon for any light. The old outpost lay ahead. Its towers stood empty, but it was their only chance. The human hovered between sleep and pain. He clutched at her clothing when the swelling pulsed. She felt his hand tremble. She knelt on a flat rock and set him down gently. His helmet lay askew. She removed it to let him breathe. His hair was matted and his face was pale beneath the dirt. She offered him water from her canteen, tilting its spout to his lips. He drank with deep gasps. Each gulp soothed his parched throat. She watched his chest rise and fall. She tapped the bandage above his knee. The orb glowed faintly, alive in the night. After he rested, she stood and offered him her hand. His legs were weak, but he took it. She helped him to his feet. His steps were unsteady, and he leaned on her shoulder as they moved onward. She sang a soft tune from her world. Her song was low and slow. It was a healing chant that soothed their minds as the night wind carried it across the dunes. He closed his eyes to its comfort. She remembered the gardens of her home planet, full of light and color. Here, only sand and stars remained. The swelling pulsed again. She placed a hand over it and pressed gently. The glow grew brighter and warmth crawled through her fingers. The orb grew larger by a few millimeters. Tiny specks drifted from its surface. They hung in the air like glowing dust motes. She drew a breath. These spores could be dangerous. She looked at the man's face. His eyes widened in pain and fear. She lifted her pouch and searched for a cooling wrap. Inside she found dried leaves from frost moss. Its chill property was weak, but she hoped it would work. She ground the leaves between smooth stones until they formed a cold paste. Before she applied it, she laid the cloth bandage aside. She spread the paste across the swelling. Its cool touch soothed the heat. The glow dimmed for a moment, then steadied at a softer brightness. He sighed and relaxed against her. She patted his back gently to calm him. She secured the paste with a fresh cloth strip. The mix smelled of night frost. It gave them both hope. She tested the wrap's firmness. It held against the movement of his leg. They pressed on until the wind began to howl. A sandstorm formed on the horizon, its dust cloud rising like a living wall. The girl guided the man to shelter beneath a rocky overhang. Grit rattled along the hard stone. She pressed her cloak around both of them. He rested his head against her chest as she whispered another chant. The storm's fury seemed to pause at her voice. Tiny grains of sand could not touch them. After several breaths, the wind calmed. The clouds of dust rolled by like gray ghosts. Then they resumed their slow trek. At dawn, they saw the outpost silhouette in the pale light. Its metal spires bore rust and sand. Towers leaned at odd angles. A single window glowed with flickering light. Relief bloomed in the girl's chest. She helped the man onto a raised platform. The steps were broken but still climbable. He took each rung as if testing it. She stayed close, ready to catch him. As they climbed, the early sun cast long shadows behind them. Hope pulsed between them, stronger than fear. They reached a heavy door built into the metal wall. The girl traced her fingers over its faded symbols. They were old language from research teams who once worked here. She pressed a control pad beside the door. Sparks flew, but the lock unlatched. The door creaked open on bent hinges. Inside lay a narrow corridor lit by flickering bulbs. Pipes lined the walls and ceilings. The air was stale but safe. She stepped back and offered her hand to the man again. He looked at her with trust. The corridor stretched ahead in a gentle curve. The girl scanned each door and panel as they walked. Faded signs spoke of biology labs and cold storage. Broken screens flickered with old data. Dust crunched under their boots. The man leaned on her, his face showing hope again. She led him toward the biology sector where she hoped to find tools to study the symbiont. The glow from his bandage shone through a slit in the cloth. She stepped forward with resolve. They had reached safety. Now she would get to work. They moved down the narrow corridor with slow, careful steps. The yellow lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the metal floor. The man leaned on the alien girl's arm as she guided him. His bandaged leg throbbed, but he kept walking. She led him toward a door marked with faded letters, Biology Lab. Inside, they found long tables littered with broken glass and dusty tools. Tubes and jars lay scattered across workbenches. Thin cables hung from the ceiling like vines. The air smelled of old chemicals and cold metal. The girl set the man by a sturdy table and helped him sit. She knelt beside him and gently peeled back the bandage. The glowing orb pulsed beneath his skin. Smaller now, but still alive, she wiped the residue from her palm and took a clean cloth from her pouch. She dabbed at the swelling, careful not to press too hard. The orb dimmed as the cloth touched it. The man breathed more easily. She studied the symbiont with wide eyes. It looked like a small, soft sack of living tissue. She wondered how it had attached itself to human flesh. On a nearby table, she spotted a scanner device. Its screen was dark but intact. She pressed a button by chance. The screen blinked to life, showing a grid of faint symbols. She tapped at icons until she found a basic tissue scan function. The machine whirred softly. She placed her hand over the orb and held the scanner above it. A soft hum filled the room. On the screen, she saw a simple outline, an alien cell structure bonded to human muscle. The girl noted how the cells glowed in the scan. She took a small vial from her pouch, filled with frost moss extract. She poured a drop onto a petri dish and placed a tiny swab of the symbiont cells into it. The dish sat under a lamp that glowed dim blue. She watched, hoping the cold would slow the cell's growth. After a moment, the cells shrank back, their glow fading. She smiled in relief. The man touched her shoulder and pointed to a set of sealed cabinets. Inside, he saw jars labeled with strange plant names. The girl opened one and found dried petals of isivine. She crushed them into a coarse powder and mixed them with water from her canteen. She applied the paste to the swelling. The man winced at first, then relaxed as the cool paste took effect. They worked side by side in quiet focus. Tools clinked softly. Wires hummed. The lab felt alive again after years of silence. The girl's heart swelled with hope. She believed they had found a way to tame the living wound. The man nodded, gratitude shining in his tired eyes. Together, they prepared for the next step. To fully separate the symbiont and free him from its strange bond, they moved deeper into the biology lab. The girl carried a small tray of glass tools. Tweezers, vials, a dropper, and a tiny blade lay on sterile cloth. The man sat on a metal chair, his bandaged leg resting on a low table. The glow of the symbiont pulsed through the cloth like a heartbeat. She took a steady breath and looked at the man. He nodded, showing trust. She explained each step in soft tones, mixing words and gestures. He listened, eyes fixed on her movements. They knew this was the moment to free him completely. She pulled a vial from her pouch. Inside was a pale liquid, clear as water. The girl had created it using frozen spores from frost moss and crushed petals of isivine. This liquid she called enzyme gel. It would dissolve the symbiont's bond without harming human flesh. She poured a few drops into a small dish. The droplets caught the light in their clear pool. She lifted the dropper and touched the tip to the glowing cells in the petri dish. The cells quivered and then began to shrink, losing their glow. A soft smile crossed her face. The test worked. She closed the dish and set it aside. The man let out a breath he did not know he held. She cleaned the tip of the dropper and loaded it again. Then she approached him. The flicker of bulbs above made shadows dance on the metal walls. She knelt beside him and unwrapped the cloth from his leg. The symbiont glowed bright for a moment. The orb felt warm and alive. She steadied her hand as she applied the enzyme gel, drop by drop. The cooling gel met the orb and sped into its living tissue. The glow dimmed, replaced by soft ripples of light. The surface of the swelling began to soften under her touch. She pressed the dropper lightly, adding more gel around the edges. The man winced in pain but stayed still. Her voice was calm. She sang the low healing chant from her world. The notes filled the room and seemed to slow the cell's frantic beat. The symbiont's grip loosened and the orb sagged like a deflating balloon. She reached for the tweezers and held them ready. Once the swelling was soft, she placed a tip at its base. She lifted gently. A thin thread of living tissue stretched between the orb and his flesh. She paused, careful not to pull too hard. Then, with a steady tug, the symbiont released. It fell onto the tray, its glow faded into a dull lump. The man gasped as the pressure left his leg. He flexed his toes and ankle. Amazed by the return of feeling, the girl watched as the wound pulsed softly where the orb had been. She pressed a clean cloth against it to stop a thin trickle of dark fluid. She cleaned the area with water and applied a bandage soaked in enzyme gel to prevent any hidden cells from regrowing. The man watched her hands, gratitude and relief in his eyes. She finished wrapping the bandage and sat back. The lab felt quiet now, as if the walls held their breath. She let out a soft exhale. He stood and took a careful step. His face lit with a surprised smile. He walked again, slower at first, then sure. The girl clapped her hands softly. He bowed his head in thanks. She tapped the scanner device and watched his leg on the screen. The faint glow was gone. The device showed normal tissue. They both laughed lightly, a sound of pure joy in the empty lab. She closed the scanner and pocketed her tools. They left the lab and stepped into the empty corridor. The sun had risen outside, sending shafts of pale light through broken windows. They paused by a metal door and turned toward each other. The man bowed deeply, offering his hand. She smiled and took it. Together they walked out into the open desert. The sky glowed pink and gold. He looked at her and nodded. She nodded back. They would return to her people and tell them of the strange bond and how kindness and science had saved a life. The journey was far from over, but for a moment, hope led the way. They paused at the threshold of the outpost as the first rays of sunlight warmed the metal walls. The girl smiled at the man, knowing they had grown stronger together. The desert stretched before them, full of dangers and hope alike. Hand in hand they stepped forward. They left the outpost behind at first light, stepping onto the cool sand as the sun rose. The alien girl led the way, her three-fingered feet steady on the dunes. Soft slope. The human followed, moving more easily now that the symbiont was gone and his leg healed. Each of them carried a small pack. She had vials of enzyme gel and a few tools. He had rations and a water pouch. Together they strode across the rippling desert, bound by a new trust. The air was crisp in the early hours. She watched him drink from his pouch and offered water from hers. They shared the clear liquid in silence, each sip a quiet pact. The girl had learned that humans preferred to drink in sips, not gulps. He learned that she tilted her canteen slowly, letting drops fall to his lips. Through shared gestures they spoke more than words. By mid-morning, the sun climbed high and the heat grew fierce. They paused at a rocky outcrop for shade. He sat and removed his helmet, wiping sweat from his brow. She knelt beside him and pressed a cool cloth on his neck. He returned the favor, tracing a finger along her forearm where a fine layer of sand had settled. Their simple acts of care eased each other's fatigue. While they rested, the man pointed to the sky, pantomiming a boiling sun and wiping his forehead. She nodded and placed a hand over her chest, then pointed toward the horizon. He understood. They would find shelter soon. He smiled weakly, and she smiled back. They both felt the strength of this new companionship. They rose again and walked. On the dunes stretched endless before them, but they knew a line of jagged hills marked the path to her home. Small dust devils spun across the sand, but the girl guided them around each one. She taught him to watch the wind patterns, and he learned to read the shifting grains. They laughed softly when a tiny whirlwind caught her cloak and lifted it, sending sand spilling over her shoulder. As the sun dipped toward afternoon, they found a hidden wash, a dry stream bed carved by rare rains. Dark stones formed a hollow basin. The girl fetched a small flask and collected a few drops of water trapped in a crevice. The man found wilting plants at the edge and dug for roots that held moisture. Together they mixed the root with water to make a cooling paste for his leg. Though healed, the bandage needed fresh treatment under these harsh conditions. They worked side by side, her hands steady as she applied the paste, his voice soft as he hummed a human tune. The paste soothed the warmth of the day and helped both of them feel hope. He told her the melody meant peace, and she repeated the word until it rolled from her tongue like a gentle song. They both laughed at her pronunciation, and that laughter became a precious bridge between their worlds. When twilight came, the air cooled and the sky turned pale violet. They climbed a small ridge to look back at the desert they had crossed. The dunes glowed like rolling waves in the fading light. The girl pointed to a line of dark shapes on the horizon. He leaned forward, squinting through the dusk. Tall spires rose beyond the hills, gleaming faintly in the dying sun. Her home lay near those towers, and his home lay now beginning to feel like hers too. They descended under a sky of stars. She spoke in her language, naming constellations he had never seen. He replied with stories of Earth's moons and their phases. Neither could share full meaning, but they shared wonder. She guided him down a dry gully careful of loose stones. He steadied her arm when her foot slipped. Together they reached the edge of the plateau. At the top they paused. Below them lay a city of silver domes and slender towers. Lights twinkled like stars fallen to the ground. Bridges arched between buildings and gentle water flowed beneath. The girl's chest swelled with pride. She pointed to the nearest gatehouse where 2 guards watched. The man straightened his pack straps, ready to meet her people. They walked the final stretch before the gate. The guards stepped aside, bowing their heads in respect as the girl approached with a human by her side. She raised her hand in greeting and spoke words of home. He offered a nod in a simple phrase he had practiced. "Thank you." The guard's eyes widened in surprise, then softened with welcome. Beyond the gate, the city's streets glowed with lantern light. Curious faces peeked from windows as they passed. The girl led him toward a large plaza where a circle of stone benches stood around a gently bubbling fountain. She guided him to a bench and sat beside him. He felt tired but alive in her world. She placed a small vial of enzyme gel on the bench between them and smiled. Together, they watched the water dance under gentle lights. They had crossed the desert, tamed a living wound, and forged a new friendship. The future lay before them like the open sands, full of unknown challenges. But for now, they rested in the glow of a shared victory and the promise of many days yet to come. They woke before dawn to the soft hum of crystal lanterns in the plaza. The air was cool and carried hints of spice from nearby market stalls. The alien girl slipped from the stone bench and offered the human a small loaf of flatbread and a sweet fruit. He ate slowly, savoring the unfamiliar taste. Together they watched the first colors of sunrise paint the silver domes beyond the gate. The girl pointed out a tall spire where scholars studied ancient life forms. The human nodded, eager to learn more. As the city stirred, they rose and gathered their packs, preparing to visit the research tower. They walked through winding streets lined with smooth stone buildings. Lanterns hung from curved roofs, showing symbols of knowledge and care. Children peeked at them with curiosity, and merchants paused in their trade to bow politely. The alien girl led the way, her hand on the human's arm when the path turned steep. He followed without complaint, trusting her steps. They passed a fountain of glowing water and paused briefly so the human could fill his canteen. The water tasted cool and clean, as if drawn from a hidden spring. Refreshed, they continued toward the research tower at the center of the city. The tower rose 4 levels high, its walls etched with carvings of strange plants and creatures. At its base, 2 scholars greeted them. The taller one held a glass jar with the faded remains of the symbiont, preserve. After their work in the outpost lab, the alien girl presented the fresh sample in a sealed container. The scholars examined it with careful fingers and scanned it with delicate instruments. The human watched, fascinated by each whir and soft beep. The scholars exchanged looks of wonder. The symbiont cells glowed in their readings, just as it had in their desert test. A soft chime echoed through the tower as the chief scientist appeared. She was older, with silver hair braided around her head and eyes that held stories of many years. She welcomed the pair into a large chamber filled with tables, screens, and jars of preserved specimens. She asked the girl to explain the healing process, and the alien girl described each step in simple words and gestures. The chief scientist listened closely, nodding and taking notes. The human added his own words, describing how the enzyme gel had eased the pain. Together, they built a clear picture of the symbiont's bond and the way to break it. The chief scientist frowned as she studied the data. She told them that other survivors had arrived in recent days, each showing signs of the same swelling. She pointed to a map of the desert region on the wall. Tiny lights pulsed in an area to the north. The map legend read Spore Field, a place where alien life gathered after great rains. She warned that the symbiont might spread if settlers or travelers passed through that field. The human and the girl exchanged a serious look. They realized this was not just a single accident but a growing threat. The Council of Elders arrived next, lowering their voices as they spoke of the city's safety. The Elders advised a careful mission to the spore field to learn why the symbiont attached to humans. They offered a small team of scholars and scouts to accompany the alien girl and the human. The team would map new areas, collect samples, and test the soil and air. The girl agreed without hesitation. She felt responsible for the living wound that had bonded to the man. The human nodded and offered to guide them through the dunes. The elders placed a small medallion on each of them, a sign of honor and trust. Preparations began at once. The scholars prepared sterile containers and sensors. The scouts sharpened their climbing sticks, and the girl packed her enzyme gel and tools. The human loaded extra rations and water canteens. They wrapped their faces in light scarves to keep sand from their eyes. City craftsmen handed each of them a simple cloak woven from desert fibers that would keep them cool by day and warm by night. They practiced brief drills in the plaza, what to do if a storm rose, how to treat a sudden infection. Each step was simple but vital. As dusk approached, they gathered at the gatehouse. Lanterns glowed like tiny suns against the purple sky. The girl turned to the human and offered him a loaf of sweetbread. He smiled and handed half back, sharing as they had at dawn. Then the chief scientist came to the gate and clasped their shoulders, whispering words of good fortune. The elders watched from the walls, their faces solemn but hopeful. The scouts raised their climbing sticks in salute. Together, the group stepped beyond the city walls into the desert. Lanterns swinging gently at their sides, the dunes rose ahead under a sky full of stars. A cool breeze brushed their skin and carried distant whispers of shifting sand. The human and the alien girl led the way, their footsteps matching in the soft ground. Behind them, the city's lights dimmed until only the oldest towers shone. The girl tightened her grip on her pack and looked at her companion. He gave her a steady nod. They both felt the weight of what lay ahead, a place of living spores, secrets waiting in the sands, and the promise of answers that might save many lives. With calm hearts and clear purpose, they set out into the night. They traveled through the night, guided by lantern light and the cool desert breeze. The scouts walked beside them, their climbing sticks tapping soft rhythms on the sand. The map in the alien girl's hand showed the spore field ahead, a low valley between two rocky ridges. Tiny lights on the map pulsed steadily, marking clusters of glowing fungus beneath the sand. Each light was a warning dot as dawn approached. The lanterns dimmed and the sky turned pale blue. The group climbed a dune ridge and paused to scan the valley below. The spore field lay before them, its surface rolling like gentle waves. Thin filaments of bioluminescent green peeked through the sand in spots. The air carried a faint earthy scent, and each breath felt heavy with hidden life. The chief scientist signaled for quiet, and they crept down the slope. The alien girl stayed close to the human, her eyes alert. She held a small sensor that could detect spore density. The device beeped softly as they walked, growing faster with each step. Scouts followed behind, their eyes cautious. The human carried a sample container and a swab. Each careful move sent faint ripples across the sand, as if something stirred beneath. Suddenly, the sensor beeped rapidly. The group stopped. The ground ahead glowed brighter where the wind had swept away loose sand. Clusters of small bulbs, like tiny lanterns, pulsed in the sunlight. Spores floated up in the air, drifting like pale dust. The human raised his arm to shield his face. The girl placed a hand on his shoulder and pointed to a rocky overhang nearby. They moved quickly. For cover. Beneath the rocks, the scouts set up a testing station. Glass vials, sensors, and data pads were arranged on flat stones. The scientists prepared sterile containers. The girl knelt beside the nearest glowing cluster. She used a thin blade to cut a small section of the filaments and place them in a vial. The material glowed softly inside the glass. The scientist scanned the sample, and numbers flickered on a small screen. They compared the data to the original symbiont cells. The chief scientist frowned. She tapped the screen and pointed to a graph. The spore cells shared DNA markers with the symbiont that had bonded to the human. It seemed the symbiont was a seed form of this larger fungus network. The human and the girl exchanged a glance. They realized that every human who passed through this field might become host to a new SYMBIO, and the elders' medallions grew heavy around their necks. The scouts stood guard, watching the field warily. The chief scientist spoke quietly to the girl and the human. They needed to find what triggered the symbiont to grow. The samples alone would not tell the whole story. They would have to study the soil and the air for clues. Together with two scouts, the girl and the human moved deeper into the field. Each step stirred spores and sent them floating upward. The man held his breath and passed a cloth over his mouth. The girl used a sensor wand to measure air composition. The readings showed high levels of warm moisture trapped beneath the sand. She marked the spots on her map. Where moisture was high, the filaments were densest. After gathering several samples, they returned to the overhang. The scientists mixed the fungal material with distilled water and enzyme gel. The solution bubbled faintly before settling into a clear liquid. The chief scientist dipped a swab into the mix and drew a small line on a sensor strip. A series of lights blinked in response. The data suggested that a cold shock could prevent the spores from activating. The alien girl and the human shared a relieved look. They had found a key. Rapid cooling could stop new bonds. The scouts packed the data pads in containers. The chief scientist formulated a plan. They would return to the city with their findings and equip travelers with cooling kit, small devices that could blast cold air and enzyme spray into the sand around a human leg. As the sun reached its height, they gathered their gear and prepared to leave. The girl placed a hand on the human's arm. He nodded, strength renewed by hope. They turned toward the ridge and began the climb back. Behind them, the spore field stretched silent and glowing under the bright sky. The journey back was steady. The scouts led the way, and the scientists carried the samples with care. The girl and the human walked side by side, no words needed. Each knew how far they had come, from a chance rescue on a desert night to unlocking the secret of a living wound. When they crested the ridge, they saw the city's spires in the distance, glinting in the late afternoon sun. The human smiled, and the girl's golden eyes shone. Together they had faced unknown danger, tamed a strange symbiont, and discovered a way to protect others. Hope pulsed between them like the gentle heartbeat of a lantern's glow. They marched down the sandy slope toward home. The scouts followed, their shadows long in the dusk light. The city gates opened wide to welcome them. The elders and scholars gathered at the walls, hearts lifted by news of success. The chief scientist spoke to the crowd of residents, describing the plan for cooling kits and new travel protocols. The people listened with gratitude and relief. Amid the cheers, the alien girl squeezed the human's hand. He returned her smile. As they stepped into the plaza, lanterns flickered on the fountain's waters and stars glimmered overhead. They had journeyed through danger and found answers. Now, in the heart of the city, they stood together as equals, two friends bound by courage, kindness, and the promise of many adventures yet to come.